And welcome back. Joining us now, Pastor Matthew Watts, Mount Hope native, but pastor of Grace Bible Church here in Charleston. And thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate you giving kudos to my hometown, Mount Hope, West Virginia. I'm always a must-stay at heart.
Well, all the thing I can remember is that Hinton High School and Mount Hope used to have some great football games back in the day, and they were pretty hard fought. If I recall, Mount Hope guys were about the toughest guys around.
We were pretty tough, and the fans were even tougher. And if we didn't beat you on the field, we would rock you when you left town. And if we won, we'd rock you anyway. It was just part of our tradition. But
well, listen, you're doing a lot of great work here in Charleston. For the last 17 years, you've been pastor at Grace Bible Church. Before that, you worked for 18 years down at Union Carbide. So you've got a really interesting experience, both as a pastor, but also as a businessman. That's pretty unique. But I want to talk to you about race relations in West Virginia and around this country. The last 2 weeks have been sort of stunning weeks in racial relations in this country. 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a case involving a Michigan constitutional amendment that you don't have to use affirmative action in admissions to the University of Michigan. Actually, I think it's not that you don't have to use it. In this particular case, it says you can't use it.
That's correct.
And the court allowed that law to stand, and while some people say it didn't really rule on an affirmative action, I think by allowing that law to stand, it did, in fact, rule on affirmative action. So that takes race out of the equation for admissions to schools, but a lot of people believe that then takes it out of equations for a lot of things in deciding hiring practices and other standards in this country. So I want to talk about that and get your reaction to that, and then I want to talk about how that ties into the Donald Sterling debacle this week in the NBA. But let's start with your thoughts on affirmative action.
Well, my understanding of the Supreme Court ruling really was that the court was saying that the states has the right to establish laws in terms of how they're going to deal with affirmative action and whether or not they're going to allow racial and sex preferences to be used in admissions to colleges. And what the court was actually saying, in my understanding, was that the Equal Protection Clause basically does not apply in that way. So Michigan passed a law, the court upheld the law, and they overturned the decision of the Sixth Circuit. But University of Michigan, while they're not going to use racial preferences or sexual preferences for admission, they will continue to use preferences for athletes, for students of alumni,
right,
and for people that are from certain communities, pretty much for the most part rural communities. And so to me, there's a little bit of duplicity and somewhat of hypocrisy there, because the reason that they would want athletes to get special treatment because they want to feel a team that could compete in the Big Ten and nationally, and they need to recruit from the pool of African-American athletes, particularly for football and basketball. So that's kind of an interesting nuance and interesting twist in terms of how they were maintaining the exception for athletes, for students of alumni, and from students from underrepresented cities and towns. So having said that, I believe that we've made a lot of progress in terms of race relationships. I also believe that there is still a need in some cases to look at racial and sexual preferences because these groups have been denied opportunities to participate. And I believe that organizations are like human beings. They tend to reproduce after their own kind. And once you create diversity in an organization, it will attract diversity. But until that happens, people tend to hire people they know and that they feel comfortable with, and the organization will continue to perpetuate themselves. But lastly, I would say with this, in terms of admission to schools, that now what we have is a situation where all public school systems are not equal. Correct. And so many children, no fault of their own, are denied access to a high quality of education because of the zip code that they live in. And they may very well have the ability to perform at the collegiate level. They may just not score as well on the ACT, the SAT test, which is the primary high-stake test that's used to determine college admission. And therefore, they're put at a disadvantage to those from high socioeconomics to do well on those tests.
And interestingly enough, these ACT and other college admission tests have actually statistically now been shown to not be a very good measure of one's ability.
That is correct.
You know as well as I do, if we grew up, we both grew up down in southern West Virginia.
That's correct.
We maybe didn't have the best schools in the world, but we knew how to work hard and we knew how to figure out how to get something done if we had to get it done, which is how we got through, not on our brains necessarily. I don't mean to be downgrading you, certainly myself, but we don't want to cut off the everyday guy, regardless of whether he's black or white.
That's correct.
You know, we've got to give a chance, because college education is ultimately a key factor in what your opportunities are in later life.
It's an extremely important factor. And if you look at the University of Michigan, their admissions of African American students, I think, are down 25%. But admissions of African American in colleges is up. So they're still continuing to go to college at other schools, not just at the prestigious University of Michigan. But I really like what West Virginia University is doing. I think that WVU might very well turn out to be a model for the rest of the nation. You know, under the leadership of our former president, Dr. Jim Clements, continuing Dr. Gordon Gee, they've established the WVU Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And the goal is to create an environment on that college campus that is sensitive to, that is open to diversity, to attract diverse students from all over the world. And I'll be going to a meeting later this week to serve on the Diversity Visiting Committee. And so the ideal is that diversity is the collective mixture of similarities and differences wherever you find them. And diversity can add value to any institution or organization. So I think WVU might be on the cusp of helping other colleges and universities to really crack this nut in terms of how you attract a diverse student population without having to use racial or sex preferences.
All right, I want to talk about the Donald Sterling issue, but we need to take a quick break.
Sure thing.
We'll be right back with Matthew Watts after this. Continuing our conversation with Matthew Watts, Pastor Matthew Watts, Grace Bible Church here in Charleston. And Matthew, let's talk about, I will tell you, I was absolutely stunned, and I realize that I'm a white guy that, you know, doesn't see the same things that many other people see in the forms of discrimination. But I thought racial discrimination was gone from this country, and I just couldn't believe when I heard him say, you know, some of these recordings of, well, to his girlfriend, well, you can't, we don't want you to bring him to the game. I don't want you hanging out with him in public. It's okay behind the scenes. Did that shock you?
Well, not really, because I knew that former NBA great and Hall of Famer Elgin Baylor, that had worked for the Clippers and for Mr. Sterling, had sued him for race discrimination. And I also knew that he had been sued by some African Americans and other minorities in terms of discrimination in housing.
Right.
So I knew that he had some strong feelings, negative feelings toward African Americans in general, African Americans in particular, minorities in general. So I wasn't surprised. But neither was I surprised in the upper echelons of the economic world that someone like Don Sterling could exist and get the cover from his colleagues and even from some of the people that worked for him that were paid extremely well, those professional athletes and those who've been in administrative and leadership positions, and have a tendency to look or turn the other way. I was surprised when the NAACP gave him an achievement award a few years ago in light of the fact of this lawsuit that had already been settled.
And they were getting ready to give him another one.
And giving him another one. And I'm embarrassed for them because it's that type of duplicity and inconsistency that sends mixed signals to the rest of the country. We got to be consistent in our principle of being opposed to race prejudice.
So I was talking to some various people around our organization about racial discrimination and sort of prejudices that are inbred or become part of one's personality. And one of them said that their kid, who is in their 20s, said, well, think about, this is sort of the end of a generation that grew up where racism was okay and it was part of everyday society, that, you know, once you get to say our age, we were grown up in a more affirmative action and in a more equal, and I know it's not perfect even in our generations. Do you think this is a generational thing? Is it getting better? The younger people?
Well, let me tell you, I am extremely excited about this generation of young people of all ethnicity, Caucasian, African American, Latino, et cetera, because I do think that they look more at people based on the content of their character. And they don't carry all the racial baggage that maybe people from our generation and before carried. But I think there is an incredibly powerful lesson we can learn from Donald Sterling. When you consider the fact in 1954, when the landmark United States Supreme Court Brown versus Board of Education came down that made school segregation illegal, Donald Sterling was 20 years of age. He was coming into manhood. The Civil Rights Movement was really being launched. In 1964, when the landmark Civil Rights Act was passed, Donald Sterling was 30 years old. In 1968, when Martin Luther King died, he was 34. So what it means is that Donald Sterling is not a man marked by his time. He's a man that resisted his times, that resisted the change that was taking place. And so I have sympathy for him. I really do. Anyone that's trapped by race prejudice and that type of dysfunction that it creates. But I'm incredibly encouraged by this generation of young adults, young professionals, and their children that's coming behind them, that we're moving in the right direction.
But the encouragement is great. The fact that racism seems to be evaporating with each generation, and it's less and less. But somehow we still have got, it seems to me, to tackle the economic imprisonment that many black people and many minorities are trapped in ghettos, or they're trapped without a job or an education. And that's the ultimate cycle we've got to break to finally and forever eliminate racism, wouldn't you think?
I would agree with you. I believe that in the 21st century, that the civil rights, social justice issue of the 21st century is equal access to quality education. There will be two types of people in America: those with good education, good literacy and numeracy skills, to be lifelong learners, to recreate themselves to be competitive in the economy, and those who don't have those skills.
And that is not just at the college level. This is really talking about K through 12 and even pre-K through 12.
It is really pre-K through 12. That's why we're excited about the West Side Revitalization and Transformation Initiative on the west side of Charleston. Arguably the most challenged and over-challenged community in the state of West Virginia. We got this West Side Revive, a robust education reform project that begins with early child development, elementary school and middle school, housing initiative, social service coordination. And we believe that the West Side can be a model and template for the rest of West Virginia and even for the rest of the country. But we certainly need to attract more attention and more support from the private sector. When you consider this, Bray, that the west side of Charleston has about 38% of the city of Charleston's population. We have 4,000 children in that community, and 62% of them, 2,400, are under the age of 12. And we have 4 of the poorest performing elementary schools in the state. So the future workforce in Charleston, basically, will be partially replenished by children from the west side of Charleston. And that's why we're inviting businesses to join us. There's a vested interest that they have in helping us to really help this group of young people get the skills that this workforce needs.
And you really bring out a statewide problem. And I would argue it's not limited to minorities.
It is not.
The fact that our education system in general is near the bottom of accomplishment in of all the states in America, puts all of our children potentially at a severe economic disadvantage when it comes time to compete on the world stage. I would argue in Mount Hope and Hinton 30, 40, 50 years ago, we got great educations. I don't think I never felt disadvantaged, but boy, when I see some of these kids from out of state, our guys need to be taught better so that they can compete.
Absolutely.
White or black.
Absolutely. I mean, and we know that where there's a concentration of poverty, whether it's inner city west side of Charleston, whether it's rural Summers or Fayette County, that's where the children are not doing as well. But I believe it is the private sector that has to engage in really helping to challenge and move public education.
And demand better results.
To demand better results. In Kanawha County, for example, I know we're out of time here, but we have a $235 million budget for Kanawha County schools. That's about $10,000 per child. That's a sizable investment that has been made by the taxpayers. And so we got to be vigilant and diligent to make sure that we get a return on that investment in terms of a well-educated young person that's ready to move on into post-secondary education to prepare for the workforce.
Matthew, you really bring out a point that's so very, very critical. And that is that no matter what we're talking about, whether it's poverty, whether it's racism, whether it's opportunity, it all circles back to education.
Absolutely.
Starts and stops there. And if we fail at education, we're going to fail elsewhere.
You're exactly right.
All right, we're going to have you back on here to
Love
keep
to
us
come back.
honest. Thank you.
Thanks for having
Matthew
me.
Watts will be back with more after this.